Hello and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. I hope all of you are doing good and taking all the precautions against the third wave of COVID. Let's begin today's The Hindu analysis. The first article that we have today is written by Mr. D.B. Venkatesh Verma, who is a former Indian ambassador to Russia. In this article, he says that India has to strike an even balance between our needs for continental security as well as maritime security. The theme of the article is that in the past decade or so, India has worked extremely aggressively in ensuring that our maritime security remains our topmost concern. We have been trying to build better relationship with the small island nations nearby India. We have also been trying to work a lot on our naval capacity by building high quality aircraft carriers and other ships. However, at the same time, the author says that India has not been able to ensure continental security. As we have seen right now, India still has existing border issues with China, with Pakistan, and even with Nepal at this point of time. The focus of this article is that if India has to ensure that its continental security is protected, we have to maintain good relationship with the Central Asian nations as well. Because in order to ensure that our regional position and our regional leadership is not challenged with respect to China's rise, it's important that we have continuous access to South Asia and the Eurasian economy as a whole. The author says that India is expected to host five Central Asian leaders, as we have discussed earlier, in the upcoming Republic Day parade. In fact, in 2015, the Prime Minister visited all the five Central Asian nations, which was important since these nations are not really at the top priority when it comes to India's foreign policy making. In fact, India's external minister, Sri S. Jaishankar, also hosted the Central Asian foreign ministers in Delhi recently. This shows that India now is giving an increased importance to the economies of the Central Asian region, realizing their importance. This comes at a time when a lot of things have happened in our region. For example, the American pullout from Afghanistan, the rise of Taliban once again conquering the country of Afghanistan, China's aggressive policies not just with other nations but with respect to India since past 1.5 years, ever since the Ladakh skirmish happened, the unrest in Central Asia with what is happening in Kazakhstan and what has been happening in Ukraine of late, the growing closeness between China and Russia, all these factors somewhere directly or indirectly influence India's security interest in the region. Our continental strategy, that is the land security, has progressed in the past 2 decades, but there are still a lot of deficiencies in this regard. As I said earlier, India's maritime vision has been far more proactive as compared to our vision for our continental security. We also have to understand that conquering China is not going to be easy when it comes to land borders or our maritime security. While China has been trying to assert its influence over India and other nations in its neighborhood, we also must understand that China's vision goes way beyond Asia. Their long-term vision seems to be to displace US as a preeminent power across the world. And for that, they are trying to influence smaller and larger nations with whatever resources that they have. They have been giving concessional loans. They have been trying to acquire as much territory as possible. They also have been taking over many national assets of other countries on lease, thus indicating the growing presence of China throughout the world. Thus, that threat cannot be taken lightly by any country, including India right now. The author says that India now has to understand that the US presence in the region is on a decline. Earlier, the US had paid a lot of attention to the Indo Pacific region and had considerable troops not just in Central Asia but also nearby South Korea and Japan, which are treaty bound allies of the US. However, if you look at the numbers of the past decade or so, you will see that the number of troops of US in this region are on a constant decline. That can be number one because of the rising influence of China. That can also be because US now wants to curtail its presence throughout the world and focus on its own economy and its own interest rather than helping out nations across the world in order to counter China. For instance, US had over 265,000 troops in its European command in 1992, which has come down to just about 65,000. The same is the decline of numbers when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, where US traditionally used to have considerable number of people from its military. Thus, if India had thought that US will come to support when it comes to its issues with China, that does not hold true right now. Even though India is a member of Quad, but Quad is clearly a non-military alliance, and thus India has to look after its own interest. Not just this, India's most trusted friend, that is Russia, is now also on good terms with China because of a common adversary, that is the US. We have also discussed multiple times how Russia itself needs China's help for its own economic revival, since its own economy is not growing at a great pace now. Thus, call it luck, chance, or our own activities, but the fact remains that no other country in the world right now faces the multitude of challenges that India is facing in terms of both the continental and the maritime dimensions. And thus, our policy needs to be proactive on both these fronts. Our focus should be on having transit routes throughout the region, having increased access to other countries also by land or by water, and working with our other partners in Central Asia, including Iran and Russia, for a more proactive engagement in the region. We should also be using platforms where we are members much more actively, such as the SCO. Also, platforms where we are not members directly, but we have to interact with them considering the ongoing situation in the region are the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. India has to ensure that its presence at the global level diplomatically is much more active as compared to earlier. One of the shortcomings of Indian diplomacy has been that our number of diplomats around the world are much lesser as compared to countries such as America and China. Our global presence and our footprint are not at par with the size of country that India is. And that is why the diplomatic structure of India needs to be much more proactive, and our presence need to be felt at various other institutions across the world. Now, the article here makes a mention of International North South Transport Corridor. It was an extremely ambitious project that was thought of in the year 2000 to provide India an alternative connectivity to the Central Asian region and to Russia. However, this project has not gone on as expected because of involvement of Iran in the project and the US sanction against Iran. Let's see what this project was. So the International North-South Corridor, as I said, was aimed to give increased connectivity to India, to Central Asia and to Russia. As you can see, the standard route of India-Russia connectivity is the blue one, which takes considerably longer time and money to transport stuff between the two nations. The alternative, that is the International North-South Corridor, was supposed to be the red route, which would connect India to Iran, then Azerbaijan, and then to Astrakhan, Moscow, and St. Petersburg in Russia. However, the involvement of Iran has slowed down the project considerably. As I said, the project was first thought of in September 2000 to promote transportation cooperation amongst the member states. Over the years, other nations in the Central Asian region have also joined in on the project, including Kazakhstan, Armenia, Tajikistan, Ukraine, Belarus, Syria, and even Turkey. The aim was to build a 7,200 kilometer long multi mode network of ship, rail, and road route for transporting freight and reducing the carriage cost between India and Russia by about 30% and reducing the transit time from 40 days by more than half. However, not much progress has been made on this project so far. Also, the Indian government is particularly concerned about our maritime security. And that is why in August 2021, when India was a president of the UNSC, the UNSC gave a presidential statement on the topic of maritime security. The statement including emphasized the safeguards of legitimate use of oceans, follow international law such as the UN Clause Law of 1982, calling on the member states to implement the International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, and asking the member states to ratify and implement the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and protocols. India specifically gave five principles for maritime security. This is important for you to remember if you have to quote them in the examination. First, free maritime trade without any barriers to establish a legitimate trade. Second, settlement of maritime disputes should be peaceful and on the basis of international law. Third, responsible maritime connectivity should be encouraged. Fourth, there is a need to collectively combat maritime threats posed by non state actors such as pirates, etc. And fifth, preserve the maritime environment and maritime resources. This highlights the fact that India gives extreme importance to the existing maritime threats and wants every country to come on board and follow the internationally accepted protocols. The next article that we have talks about the recent announcement of election schedule for 5 states by the Election Commission of India. As you know, the schedule for assembly elections was announced by the Election Commission on January 8. Apart from the announcement of the schedule, the Election Commission also said that there will not be any physical campaigning till 15th of Jan due to the ongoing third wave. Also, the Election Commission said that after 15th of Jan, the situation would be assessed again to see if further rallies would be allowed. This is because during the second wave, there was a lot of opposition to the decision of the Election Commission to allow political rallies to take place in states such as West Bengal, which led to increase in the cases of coronavirus. The Election Commission has said that till then, the political parties and the candidates can use online methods to reach out to their voters. Now, this new advice by the Election Commission to use social media and other online platforms throws another challenge to the Election Commission of India. That is, how would the Commission now enforce the model code of conduct and monitor the expenditure of the candidates that they are making on themselves? As you know, there is a limit on the maximum expenditure that any candidate can make for Lok Sabha or for state assembly elections while campaigning. However, keeping a track of that expenditure has always been a difficult exercise for the Election Commission, and it is going to become even more difficult in the present scenario. Thus, it is an extremely tough test for the Election Commission. The onus is also on the political parties to follow the protocol of the Model Code of Conduct and ensure that their conduct is as per the guidelines. Unfortunately, we have seen that the social media campaigns, anyways, are extremely toxic. It is extremely easy to spread false information against anyone on social media since there are very little or zero background verification checks of the information that you are publishing. The election season, anyway, is a time when India becomes extremely divisive on issues such as religion, caste, political parties, etc. And we would do well not to get indulged in such politics once again with the ongoing election, and the onus of maintaining that conduct is on the political parties and on the Election Commission of India itself. It is also important to note, how does the Model Code of Conduct work and does it have any legal basis or not? I am sure all of you would have read that in Indian polity. Model Code of Conduct is not a legal framework. It is just a set of guidelines given by the Election Commission to regulate political parties and candidates prior to elections. So these are guidelines that tell the political parties and candidates how should you conduct before the elections. For instance, it says that you cannot go to a religious place and then ask the people for votes. It says that during your rally or campaigning, you should not cause any traffic jams, etc. You should not offer anything in return for the votes from the people. You should not make personal remarks against your opposing candidates. These are the main guidelines of the Model Code of Conduct. These guidelines help the Election Commission in ensuring that the mandate given to the Commission under Article 324 of the Constitution to supervise and conduct free and fair elections is made possible. The Model Code of Conduct also is a time when the political party in power cannot announce any new schemes or cannot hold any new recruitments. The code becomes operational from the date on which the election schedule is announced. So, because the Election Commission of India announced the schedule on 8th of Jan 2022, this is the date on which the Model Code of Conduct began, and it will be enforced until the results are announced. The Model Code of Conduct, interestingly, first came up in the state of Kerala in 1960 when a code of conduct was given by the administration. Then, for the Lok Sabha elections in 1962, the Model Code of Conduct was circulated by the Election Commission of India to all the recognized political parties and the state governments, and it was followed by most of them, since we were living at a time when the political parties are much more decent and they wanted to follow the law of the land. However, during 1970s and 1980s, we saw that not a lot of importance was given to this code by the political parties. Most of them violated it knowingly. They did not follow it because it did not have any legal consequences. Thus, it was in 1991 that the Election Commission of India decided to enforce it much more strictly. It mainly contains provisions in 8 different areas. That is, general conduct of the candidates, how exactly can they hold meetings, how can they hold processions, how to conduct themselves on the day of the polling, what can they and what can they not do on the polling booth, how should the observers of the political parties behave, what can the party in power do and not do, and what guidelines to follow for making your election manifestos. Let's assume that a political party or a candidate goes against the model code of conduct. Then what would happen? Since there is no legal backing to it, that means that they cannot be jailed or fined or something like this. But the election commission itself can take action. For example, if the commission thinks that a candidate is making speeches which are spreading communal hate and which is against the model code of conduct, then that particular candidate can be banned by the Election Commission of India from campaigning for some days. Or the Election Commission of India can even, in most drastic cases, suspend the candidate from contesting elections, although this is very rare. As we have discussed repeatedly, although the Model Code of Conduct does not have any legal backing, there are some provisions of the Model Code of Conduct that can be enforced because they are written separately in certain laws, such as the IPC, the Representation of People Act 1951, etc. Let me give you a very simple example. So, one of the points in Model Code of Conduct in terms of how the party in power can behave is that the party in power cannot use government machinery or government officials to do their party related work. So, for example, the Prime Minister cannot ask an IAS officer to do a work which is related to his political party or BJP's campaigning. Now, as you would know, in 1970s, when Indira Gandhi had won her Lok Sabha election, the Allahabad High Court ruled against her on the charge that Indira Gandhi government had used the services of an IAS officer who was on government duty but was asked to do a job for the Congress party. Now, the twist was that IAS officer had already resigned from the service, but just that his resignation was not officially accepted by the authorities before he started working for the Congress party. Now, although this provision does not have a legal backing, but even then the court decided against Indira Gandhi. How? Because this is also written in the Representation of People Act 1951. So, some parts of the Model Code of Conduct can be enforced, but only those that are written in separate laws altogether. The next article that we have talks about the ongoing collaborations that we are seeing in the field of social sector in India. Now, in very simple terms, this article says that of late, a lot of small and big NGOs have teamed up together, and they have also teamed up with philanthropists who want to spend money for good cause so that they can bring a social change in the country. The authors say that this is a great initiative and we need to have more such collaborations. Now, the fact is that ever since the COVID pandemic started, a lot of NGOs in India started facing shortage of funds. The reason why this happened was that most of these NGOs were getting funds from the corporate through their CSR funding. But when the COVID pandemic hit, the government gave an indirect push to the corporates, asking them to donate these funds to the PM CARES Fund, which was used for COVID related initiatives. So the year 2020 and 2021 was extremely difficult for the NGOs because their funds died down and most of them were diverted towards the government's pandemic response. Now, many small NGOs which don't have a lot of funding, they depend on monthly or yearly funding from the corporates. So even if they don't get funding for a few months or 1 year, they would have to stop their operations. The larger NGOs, on the other hand, can sustain without funds for some period of time because they do have a corpus. That is when the smaller NGOs that might have a good network started collaborating with the larger NGOs and philanthropists so that they can use the funds of larger NGOs and continue their operations. These are the kind of collaborations that the authors here are talking about, and they have also given examples of collaborations such as the Action Collab, India Protector Alliance, Future of Compact Collaborative, and Coalition for Government Empowerment, etc., which have given excellent results and have ensured that a lot of social problems in India are alleviated. The authors say that they conducted a study in 2020 when the number of such collaborations in India were much lower as compared to what they are right now. Also, now these collaborators are able to mobilize much greater funding because they have understood how exactly would their collaboration work. Most of them are giving emphasis on issues of justice, inclusion, equity, etc. Most of these NGOs that are forming a collaboration are focusing on the needs of the marginalized communities, such as waste pickers, frontline workers, migrant laborers, etc. Migrant laborers, especially, have faced a lot of difficult times since the beginning of 2020, with most of them losing their jobs or having to go back to their homes where they could not find enough livelihood. India has about 14 crore migrant workers, most of whom do not have any fixed job of respectable salary. The authors also say that these collaborations are not very easy to maintain. The reason is that when two or more organizations or people come together to work, they have different priorities. Let's assume there's a small NGO who is working in the area of women empowerment. They have collaborated with a bigger NGO that has funds, but the bigger NGO wants them to work for old age homes and not for women empowerment. So, how do they synergize? How do they make sure that they are working together and understand each other's goals and aims is a difficult job. Different organizations have a different way of working, and it may not be easy for them to collaborate on all these aspects. However, considering that the present situation does not seem to become better anytime soon, and we are still facing the issues of third wave with no end in sight of the pandemic, the NGOs have learned the art of collaboration, and it is in their own best interest if they want to make a collective impact in the long run. Now, the reason why we have so much emphasis on the NGOs and such collaborations in India is because for a country of India's size and scale, it is extremely difficult for the government alone to fulfill the needs of the people. We require a very robust non government sector so that these organizations can come and fill in the gaps that the government has left in the social sector. On the other hand, we also require a constant support from the government because in order to bring a large scale change the government has to step up, be it healthcare, be it education. You cannot expect any NGO to build hospitals on a scale that India requires. At the end of the day, the expenditure on healthcare education has to come from the government only. Let's see the status of government's effort in improving the problems of our social sector. Now, the problem is that India's progress in our social sector has been much slower as compared to the growth that our GDP has shown. The social sector expenditure is much lower than expected. The expenditure in education as a percentage of GDP is just about 2.8 to 3%, which is much lower than our own aim of 6% of GDP. In fact, long back in 1968, in our national policy on education, the recommendation was that the expenditure on education should be at least 6% of the GDP. The same aim of 6% was reiterated in the new education policy of 2020. In case of health, also, the situation is very similar. The expenditure on health as a percentage of GDP increased from 1.2% to 1.5%, which is again almost half of what is required to be spent by the government. This is all the more critical considering the ongoing and any other future pandemics that we may have to face. The key issues in India's social sector that government and the NGOs need to focus on include the problem of undernutrition that has been highlighted in multiple national family health surveys, including the latest one. The quality of education that we have needs to be improved, which requires much increased public expenditure on infrastructure and on appropriate training. There have to be social safety nets, especially for poor people such as migrant laborers, such as retired people, old age people who do not have any financial backing to support them. Then we also need to continue with the programs for vulnerable section of the society. Schemes such as the Saubhagya Yojana, the Ujjwala Yojana, etc. must continue with the government expenditure only increasing in those schemes. The next article talks about the government's effort to amend the Registration of Birth and Death Act 1969, also called the RBD Act. In very simple terms, as per this act, at present, it is the state government's responsibility to maintain a database of deaths and births taking place in their state. The central government now says that there is need of a national database, that is, death and birth of people should be maintained at a national level, and also the data should be shared real time with other authorities so that changes can be made instantly. For example, if we come to know that a certain person has died, immediately his or her driving license should be cancelled. Immediately his or her Aadhaar or passport, etc., should be cancelled. That, as per the government, would only be done if there is a national database maintained. The author here, however, argues against the government initiative to make changes in this act. The author here says that the act is working perfectly fine and there are different parameters that are taken into consideration in different states and there are no deficiencies in the system. Also, the author says that for database such as voter list, driving license, passport, etc., you don't need to update them instantly. Even if a dead person's passport is invalidated after 3 months or 4 months, it would not make much of a difference. And that is why the amendments that the government is trying to introduce are unnecessary. The government just wants to take more powers in its own hands while depriving the state governments of those powers. The government, on the other hand, says that having a national database of births and death would help in updating records such as a national population register, voter list, etc. As per the Act, currently, there has to be a chief registrar appointed in every state for the implementation of this Act. The new provision in the Act says that this chief registrar, while still working at the state level, must have the responsibility to integrate the state data with the national data and keep it updated with the Registrar General of India to ensure that our data for National Population Register, census, etc. is up to date and exact. The author here argues that this is not really a problem that the government should try and solve. What is the need for these databases to give instant information to other lists such as voter list, driving license, etc.? For example, right now the voter list is updated once in 6 months and it works perfectly fine. The same can be done for others without really having to make such changes in the law. Also, if we have to ensure that these state lists are now compiled in such a manner that they are given a unique structure, then we have to input the Aadhaar number also to link information to other databases. The government thus is trying to amend the law that for having birth or death certificate, giving Aadhaar number would also be mandatory. Obviously, the child that has just taken birth, his or her Aadhaar card would not be available. Then the Aadhaar data of the parents would be written there. At the time of registering death also, the Aadhaar number has to be mandatorily given. The author here says that including Aadhaar number in that form does not need an amendment in the law because the center government had already asked the states that when you make the people fill up the form, in your form, make one more column for the Aadhaar number. And that is being followed. So why does the government need to change an entire law? This is just an unnecessary duplication. The work that the central government wants to do is already being done at the different state level. So why do you want the authorities to do that all over again? The other problem that the author points out is there are different formats followed in different states. For example, many people in the states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu have the name of their family or the father's name preceding their first name. For example, I have a friend from Tamil Nadu. His name is M. Shiv Kumar, where M stands for the name of his father. But now when you use the same kind of database, that is first name, middle name and surname format to be inserted in the national database, it would create a lot of confusion and can lead to incorrect information in population registers, Aadhaar database, passport, etc. And the government must avoid that. The new law says that the certificates of birth or death issued under the RBD Act should be used for issuing Aadhaar cards, passport, driving license, etc. The author again says that this again is the practice even today. Thus, it is an unnecessary provision. Even today, if you apply for a passport, the birth certificates issued by these authorities for birth and death, etc., are accepted as a proof of date and birth. So, why do you want to write it in the law and duplicate whatever is already being done? Rather than that, the focus should be on computerizing because many states right now are still updating the data of death and birth manually. So, to avoid these mistakes and to make the system much more efficient, the focus should not be on getting all of them under one single window of the center government. Rather, the state government should be encouraged and pushed towards using computerization and better technology to maintain such records. Now, as we discussed, the Registration of Birth and Death Act, originally passed in 1969, said that the state governments will avoid a chief registrar responsible for compiling the data and following this act. The amendment now says that this chief registrar will have to integrate this data with the national level, which the Registrar General of India would maintain and use it for National Population Register, census, and other data. The central government wants to use this data to update the National Population Register and Electoral Register apart from Aadhaar, ration card, etc. As per the government, the National Population Register already has a database of 119 crore residents, and under the citizenship rules, it is a first step towards the creation of the NRC. That is why it is also seen as the government's attempt to reintroduce the debate of the NRC. The next article that we have talks about the government's need to relook into the bilateral investment treaties that India has signed, and why is it that we have not been able to sign more treaties like that. As per the article, the Standing Committee on External Affairs has recently given a report to the changes that the government should make to the model bilateral investment treaty that the government uses to sign such agreements with the other nations. Now, the article starts by saying, why is it that the committee was looking into the question of bilateral investment treaties? There are three reasons given. Number one, it talks about the White Industries case. Now, what is the White Industries case and what is the BIT? Let's start with understanding what is BIT. Bilateral investment treaty is a treaty signed between two countries. For example, let's assume India wants a lot of investment to come from Saudi Arabia. So Indian government will sign a BIT with Saudi Arabia. In this treaty, there will be provisions about protecting the interest of investors who have invested money from Saudi Arabia to India. For example, the treaty will say that if an investment comes to India from Saudi Arabia, an Indian government or Indian company does not follow the contract that they have signed, then the Indian government will pay some money to the investor, or the Indian court can hear the matter. Basically, in simple terms, these treaties are signed to protect the interest of the investors who want to invest in each other's countries. Now, what is the White Industries case? White Industries basically is a company from Australia. In 1990s, they had signed an agreement with Coal India Limited about extraction of coal from Bihar. So the point was that White Industries will give equipments to Coal India. Coal India will extract coal. Coal will be shared between the two, and that is how the companies will make money. After a few years, White Industries was not happy. They said that good quality of coal is not coming out, so they want a refund of the money that they have spent in the machines. But Coal India did not give a refund. The White Industries then went to an arbitration tribunal. The tribunal asked the Indian government to give $4 million to the White Industries for compensating them. But the government did not listen. The White Industries even filed a case in Delhi High Court, but for many years it was not heard. Then White Industries went to Indian Supreme Court, and eventually the government of India had to pay a big sum to the White Industries. Not just this, India's prestige at the international level of not following the investment treaty also took a big hit, and that hurt a lot of investments coming into India. After the White Industries case, foreign investors have sued India about 20 times for not following the BIT treaty. India, in fact, remains one of the highest sued countries in the entire world for not following such treaties. Thus, the committee gave a report on what changes can we make. The second reason why committee was looking into it was India adopted a new model treaty in 2016. The model treaty means the government gave a framework of such a treaty and said that whenever we are negotiating a treaty, let's say with US, Australia, Israel, Ukraine, etc., we will start with this model treaty and make some changes in this. But this model treaty will remain a framework that we will largely follow. Since 2016, we have been following this model treaty only, which is different from the earlier one. Third, India is currently in the process of negotiating new investment deals with countries such as UK, Australia, South Korea, etc. And that is why the government thought that if we improve our investment treaties, it will be better for us anyway. The recommendations of the committee are: number one, India has signed very few investment treaties since 2016, since we have adopted the new BIT. Means there is something wrong with it. The committee also said that the government should expedite the ongoing negotiations and conclude the agreements as early as possible. The BITs have the potential to increase foreign direct investment in India, and that is why the government should pay a lot of attention to these. Third, the committee said that India's model BIT needs to be fine tuned. The model treaty that we have right now gives more importance to the interest of the Indian government rather than the interest of the investors. So, how can you expect the investors to come and invest their money in India? Model treaty should keep both these things in mind. There should be a balance between the interest of the Indian government and authorities and the interest of the investors who want to bring their money to India. Just focusing on the need of the state will not help us in attracting investors from outside. Fourth, the committee also recommended that the power of government officials should also be increased to solve issues with regards to such treaties. The author says that the reason that Indian government has to face so many cases against such treaties is due to poor governance. We have seen a lot of retrospective laws in India, like the Vodafone case. Kane has also sued India. The Indian government also recently took away the S-band satellite spectrum from Devas. Now they are also suing India and are also taking over Indian government's assets. So Indian government has had a history of making big promises to companies and investors and then going back on them. First, this hurts India financially. Second, it also hurts the image of India in front of the foreign investors who want to come to India. Thus, the Indian government, if it wants to be strict, it should be strict from the very first point onwards. We should not change our regulations in between an ongoing deal, which gives a really bad name to India. Let's also look at what exactly is the model BIT that we talked about. As I said, the bilateral investment treaties are signed between two countries to protect the investment made by investors of both countries. They impose conditions on what can the government do and not do against the investment. They prevent undue interference and help protect the right of the foreign investors. India signed its first such treaty in 1994 with the UK and since then has signed 86 treaties, with the last one being with Brazil in 2020. It helps in bringing more FDI into India and therefore has been favored by governments. However, as I said, there have been many cases of penalty against India because India has not been following the provisions that were written in the initial treaty that was signed. Thus, the Indian government decided that because a lot of people are going to courts against us, let's change the model treaty and see what happens now. So, in 2016, we launched a model BIT which aims to negotiate, which will be used as a base to negotiate the new treaties that Indian government signs. As per the 2016 model treaty, India has moved away from a very investor friendly country to a country which is much more protectionist. So before 2016, we were promising everything to the investors just to bring them to India. That was leading to a lot of problems. Now our approach is that the government would have power to regulate the investors from the very first day onwards. Since 2016, India has terminated 66 BITs, which sends a very negative signal to the global investor community, and that is why India has been facing a declining FDI trend in the past few years. Since 2016, India has only signed 3 such treaties and none of them have come into force yet. Thus, it is high time that the government looks into what is wrong with our model BIT and our further investments. The issues with the current model BIT is number one, it gives a very narrow definition of investment and money coming into India is not really secured as per the investors. Secondly, India gives a big negative list, means a list of sectors which will not apply to the BIT. Thus, the investors are not happy with that. Third, exhaustion of domestic remedy clause means now the treaty says that before going to any international tribunal, the investor must first appeal in Indian High Court, Indian Supreme Court. Only when all the domestic remedy is exhausted, only then you can go to tribunals, which will take a long time. Fourth, it gives a lot of discretionary power to the government of India, which is not really liked by the investor. Some suggestions are that the government can adopt a hybrid definition of investment to attract more people to bring their capital to India, and the government would do well to follow international norms that are followed by other countries around the world. These are the articles we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, is it time to provide a legal backing to the Model Code of Conduct to empower the Election Commission of India to keep the election campaigning in line? Discuss some of the limitations Election Commission of India faces in enforcing the Model Code of Conduct at present. Second, Evaluate the performance of India's social service sector. Give examples of some positive outcomes due to the work done by the organizations in this sector. Both these questions have to be answered in 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.